أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم Assalamu alaikum. Good morning and welcome. Firstly, I'd like to extend my thanks to Amir Adnan and his team who have worked so hard over the last few months to provide us with this venue and opportunity to come together. I'm going to start off with some ayats of Surah Muhammad, which Habib will now recite for us, inshallah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم إنما الحياة الدنيا لعب وله وإن تؤمنوا وتتقوا يؤتكم أجوركم ولا يسألكم أموالكم إن يسألكموها فيحفكم تبخلوا ويخرج أضغانكم ها أنتم هؤلاء تدعون لتنفقوا في سبيل الله فمنكم من يبخل ومن يبخل فإنما يبخل عن نفسه والله الغني وأنتم الفقراء وإن تتولوا يستبدل قوما غيركم ثم لا يكونوا أمثالكم صدق الله مولانا العظيم.
In these ayats of Quran, in Surah Muhammad, Allah says, the life of the dunya is merely a game and diversion. If you have iman and taqwa, He will pay you your wages and not ask you for all your wealth. If He did ask you for it and put you under pressure, you would be tight-fisted and it would bring out your malevolence. Here you are then, people who are called upon to spend in the way of Allah, and then some of you are tight-fisted. But whoever is tight-fisted is only tight-fisted to himself. Allah is rich and you are poor. If you turn away, He will replace you with a people other than yourselves, and they will not be like you. Alhamdulillah, we're here to celebrate the good news of Islam, to realize the importance of the teaching of our beloved Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and the first community of Muslims who embodied this teaching, what we know as Amal Medina. The struggle and integrity of that first community of Muslims has stood the test of time and worldly events, ensuring that humanity continues into the future with the tools and understanding needed to establish and maintain a just, strong and healthy society. A society of people firmly rooted in remembrance of their Creator and understanding of their role in creation, positively influencing the environment in which they find themselves. The completeness of this social model, the Amal Medina, provides us with the keys to unlocking the real potential of a people, a means to building a balanced society where every member within it has their place and their means, protected from injustice. It was precisely this understanding that brought me to the point of becoming Muslim nearly 20 years ago. Prior to that moment in my life, that moment of awakening, I had only been able to stand in horror and dismay at the world that I was expected to become a part of. And what I had been able to ascertain from the miserable history lessons that we were forced to endure at secondary school was that during a period of time between the horrific events of the French Revolution until today, was that society was supposed to have reached a peak, following a positive transition from the pre-industrial era into the modern-day capitalist environment, with its welfare state, free education for all, and the National Health Service. According to history, the lessons had been learnt. A century of bloody warfare had been the price laid down to ensure safe and just environment for the people of this island we call Britain. But this rosy picture of modern-day Britain that I had been spoon-fed, generously laced with liberal socialist thinking, seemed to conflict with the realities that presented themselves day after day in the news and the media. Even at that age, I had already seen my fair share of news footage from the Vietnam War there was the very real threat of nuclear destruction, with the misery of those under communism on the one side of the Iron Curtain, and the rest of the civilized world, protected by the United States, on the other. Then there was famine in Ethiopia, caused by the displacement of a people by civil war. It was horrifying to see that so many people were dying and suffering, and here I was, sitting on top of it all, in civilized and safe Britain. The British public, of course, did their part. They raised funds for such disasters. The more conscientious could join Greenpeace or CND and send money off in the hope that some good would come of it. But what really struck me about the situation was that despite an elaborate media smokescreen of terrifying world events, life in Britain wasn't exactly a bed of roses either. My father, in a desperate attempt to maintain some peace of heart and sanity, was one of those people who joined Greenpeace and CND and a few other Save the World charities. His way of surviving the injustice of it all would be to bundle us all up in his car and drive as far north as we possibly could get. And strangely enough, we always ended up in the north of Scotland. The only part of these journeys that I really didn't like was the drive to and from our destination, because although my father did his very best to avoid getting anywhere near major cities, we inevitably went through the outskirts of many, and the view of lush green rolling hills was somewhat spoilt by open-cast coal mines, deserted pitheads, black slag heaps and power stations with their enormous cooling towers, and the abandoned remains of giant industrial complexes. In the cities, the view was no more pleasant, with hundreds of thousands of people contained in decaying high-rise flats. And I will never forget the first time and the last time that I ever visited Liverpool. At that point in my life, I don't think I'd ever seen so much misery and decay. The streets were full of drunkards and homeless. Children amused themselves by burning down entire housing blocks, which had been abandoned due to them being claimed unfit for human habitation. And the more I looked, the more I travelled, the more I realised that there was something very wrong in Britain, and it was getting worse, not better. Despite the elaborate attempts of the political machine to make us believe that the system worked, and that by voting we were in control. At that time, as now, unemployment figures were rising, crime was rising, rioting and civil unrest in Britain's major cities was exploding. The price of fuel was starting its upward trend. Taxation in all respects was also on the increase, and we saw the introduction of the famous poll tax, later to be cleverly renamed the council tax, which left the people of Britain gasping on their knees. This was, of course, something they could do nothing about. Every day, more and more small businesses collapse. It's almost impossible today to find any family businesses. All in all, the view of Britain was a country coming to the end of the end. Little did I know that then things would even get worse. But there was expansion in other areas. It's careful to note. It's important that we see that other areas were growing amongst this chaos. And we need to know this if we're going to get a realistic picture of the condition of Britain. So where was the growth? Well, during the last 20 years, we've seen expansion in the banking sector, more specifically in the sector of personal loans, with more and more credit being made available on the market. The banks benevolently providing disgruntled people with the power to change their personal situations. In some ways, these banks have realized their potential in a new, ever-expanding market. They believe that they, and they alone, can provide economic self-empowerment to a population disillusioned by unfulfilled government promises and a declining economy. To the banking sector, it's all about creating and at the same time quenching the individual thirst for spending power. And as long as the people don't read the small print too carefully, and much less read between the lines, they'll never realize the trap that they're falling into, or foresee the consequences of this temporary sense of release. The most alarming realization is that the biggest client of the banks in this country is, and historically always has been, the British government itself. A government desperately trying to find new ways of keeping the lid on the debt crisis. To give you a general idea of just how desperate the government is today, let's look at the figures reported to the European Commission at the end of March 2006. During 2005, government borrowed around £50 billion from banks and financiers. The general government debt has risen to some £525.9 billion. That's equivalent to 42.8%, nearly half the national GDP. And who do you think is going to pay that debt? It's true that the population of Britain has risen to 60 million people, but 16% of them are over 65. The other 20% are under 16 years of age. And what's left of the working population is really only 74.5% with employment, and the rest are either claiming benefits or in education. This means that 47.5% of Britain's population is carrying the weight of not only the families, the old and the young, but also the entire weight of government expenditure, health, education, benefit payments, inland security, and of course the heaviest cost of all, yet more warfare. We haven't even started to take into account the interest debt payments that the government must make to service its debt to the moneylenders. Some shocking reports state that as much as 17% of the population in this country are still living below what's known as the poverty line. It's scary to think that just recently it was reported that the British government needed to put together some £630 billion just to cover the costs of the pensions. The entire social structure of Britain is hanging on a very thin thread, and just how much longer can they sustain such unsupported expenditure? But you can't say the government hasn't tried its hardest to cut down on expenditure in an attempt to trim down this enormous figure. The economists, with their powerful, intricate language known only unto themselves, can argue that the economy is in growth, that things have never looked better. It really is baffling, and the inside word amongst most government ministers is that they are just as baffled as the rest of us are. The game has been played for so long, so well, and yet hasn't come crashing down around our ears, yet. Government has always taken measures when the crisis gets really scary. An example of this is when the British government realised that they could circumvent some of their heavy spending by putting the banks directly in contact with a new market of clients, the country's students. Instead of the government raising taxes and subsidising their expenditure with yet more loans, a risky business at the best of times, implying massive interest payments, they would simply cut funds to higher education and university students, kindly showing them the door to the bank's lending department. Therefore, the rising educated population of Britain, those being prepared to fulfil the positions of employment and lead Britain into a better future, if they ever got that far, would have to start off their careers by paying back their interest debts to the banks. Perhaps that's good training for them, if they're going to fit into a productive capitalist future. One doesn't have to walk very far in any city today to find homeless people and unemployed, hanging around, it seems, with nothing to do. And don't make this mistake, please, of thinking that they're all criminals and that they're all drug addicts, because in many cases the people have simply been left to fend for themselves, and they haven't been able to do so. There are vast areas of our cities where there are simply no opportunities, there are no sources of income available at all. They no longer fit into a government plan, and they've become an unavoidable and an unviable embarrassment to the failing leadership of this country. The fact is that as long as increasing debt and heavy taxation remain the tools by which each progressive government manages its term in office, the people in Britain can never expect them to rule this country with justice, and their solutions will not be generous ones. They are too compromised by their dance with the banking system, and will only make the mess even messier. Going back then, going back to when I first started to open my eyes to all this in the early 80s, I was finding it very hard dealing with the prospect that I and everyone else around me, including my dear parents, were helpless to change anything that was going on, in Britain or anywhere else for that matter, and as long as the only option was democratically elected government and towing the line.